Buonasera a tutti, good evening and welcome to the Italian Radio Hour. Io sono Viviana and I would like to welcome back our regular listeners and also welcome any new listeners. Also be sure to like us on Instagram and Facebook at Italian Radio Hour and subscribe to our YouTube channel to catch up on any past video interviews. Vorrei dare il benvenuto ai nostri ascoltatori da tutto il mondo, grazie per essere con noi anche oggi mentre continuiamo il nostro viaggio per l'Italia e la cultura italiana. So today we're going to have a very special guest engage in a very unique conversation and topic, which is the role of women in the mafia. And today with us we have Professor Felia Allum, who is a professor at the University of Bath and a leader scholar on organized crime. Her research challenges traditional narratives that portray mafia women solely as passive figures or victims. Instead, she explores their active roles within criminal organizations, whether as enforcers, financial managers, or silent power brokers. Through her work, she sheds light on how gender dynamics shape mafia structures and how women navigate these criminal worlds while also dealing with societal expectations. She has published extensively on the subject, including books and academic articles that delve into the intersection of gender, crime, and politics. Her research is particularly significant in context of law enforcement efforts to dismantle mafia organizations, as understanding women's roles can provide new strategies for combating organized crime. So sit back and relax, don't go anywhere, ma prima... Parli italiano? Do you want to learn, improve, or master your Italian? Istituto Mondo Italiano can help. Located in the heart of Regent Square, Mondo Italiano offers small group classes and one-on-one private tutoring in person or online to help you learn Italian in no time. Visit us online at istitutomondoitaliano.org. Well, Professor Allum, it's a true pleasure to have you on the program. How are you today?
I'm very well, and thank you for inviting me for this conversation.
So my interest in this topic and then eventually being put in touch with you was triggered by a recent, I think, film festival on the topic that was held. Maybe refresh my memory whether it was in London or somewhere else.
In London.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about the program and the reception that this festival received.
So I've been kind of working on Italian Mafias for the last 25 years. My whole academic career has been looking at various dimensions of Italian Mafias with a specific interest in the Neapolitan Mafia, but also the other mafias. And in 2018, I was very fortunate to win a grant which allowed me to take time away from university, not have to teach and do all the normal stuff, and take time away to consider the idea of gender within organized crime groups. And the project was a comparative one, and I've still got to finish that. But COVID hit, and that kind of restricted my real kind of field work. So I kind of went back and reflected what I could do with my time, and it allowed me to start thinking more seriously about my own relationship with the question of gender, but also in relation to Naples and the Neapolitan Mafia, the Camorra, because it's a context that I've been looking at for a long time. And parallel to this particular kind of process of thinking, I started having conversations with Cinema Italia UK, which is a charity based in London, whose aim and objective is to bring films to London, obviously Italian films to London, and share them with the British public. And we started having these conversations, in particular with Clara, who is the founder of Cinema Italia UK, and wanting to really kind of challenge the audience to not necessarily just, how can I say, consume a film around mafia with the usual stereotypes, in particular when it comes to the portrayal of Italian mafia groups, and to try and kind of, even if we have a film where there are only leading men, to think about the women, because my research kind of did not take the kind of the standard position, which is women are victims or women are passive, as a kind of starting point or as a full stop. So I really wanted to relay what I was seeing in the field with this kind of more cultural representation. And Clara, who is a wonderful cinema buff, was really happy to kind of engage with that conversation, say, well, what kind of films, what can we be doing? So we did our first edition during COVID, and it was all online, and we were able to show a whole variety of different films, including Cento Passi, which obviously is a really kind of important film, but to try and push the audience to look at the women and to think about the women's role and to think about, you know, if there was something else that we needed to think about. And this year we had our last edition. For the moment, we've done 5 years, and in particular this year we had 2 films which were focused very much on men's accounts and men's stories. So it was Il Giudice e il Magistrato, which is a wonderful film recounting the life and the challenges that the judge Terranova faced, Cesare Terranova, who was one of the kind of pre-runners, if you want. Without him, we wouldn't have had Borsellino and Falcone. And then the other film was Idu, which is Sicilian Letters in English, which looks at Matteo Messina Denaro and his kind of life as a fugitive. And both films, you know, very strong male accounts, but again, we were trying to sort of think and push the audience to think about the women and to show that the women are aware, they're involved, they do have a role, and that we have to therefore think differently about how we consider mafias, because it seems to me that for too long, the categories that we've had and that we use to look at Italian mafias are male-centric. And if we just turn that on its head, all of a sudden we see women and we see them as participants. We see them, in particular, they have agency. And it was a kind of, in relation to my research and my research findings, was to try and bring that analysis to a context, a different context, to sort of say this isn't just about consuming cultural products, but it's also thinking, yeah, you know, in the story of Matteo Messina Denaro, we have the sister, we have the woman who keeps him and hides him away. We have these different roles where they're not passive women, they're women who have a voice, they're women who have agency. So the film festival was really trying to sort of challenge these, and we were very lucky last year to, in particular, to be able to show in London La Sfida by Francesco Rosi, which again is a really interesting film made in the 1950s, which recounts the story of Pupetta Maresca in Naples. And again, you know, it was highly kind of thrilling in a way to see it, because it's not been shown very recently, but to look at the role of the young woman, the wife, and how the wife participates and is involved in the guapo, in the boss's kind of life. And the last scene, which is a very dramatic scene where she, you know, finds her husband dead on the floor and she screams, and it kind of, you know, encapsulates to a certain degree what we were trying to do, which is say, let's look at the women and take them seriously.
Mm-hmm. So obviously, as I said before, and as you mentioned, you have been studying and analyzing, you've been writing extensively on the topic, and for instance, analyzing the role of women in the Italian Mafias, the case of the Neapolitan Camorra. And I was wondering if you can elaborate. Kind of, you alluded, you used the expression women as reserve army. So if you can elaborate a little more about this concept and how it manifests within the Camorra.
So this concept is a concept which I think I've kind of come to a conclusion that it's helpful, but again, helpful only in certain moments. I've been able to interview former members of various mafias, and for me that's been an important part of listening to the insider's account, listening to the insider's story. And when it comes to women, I was able to interview 6 women from the Camorra, where it struck me very clearly that we weren't listening to them, or that we were dismissing them, or that we were erasing them. And therefore, years ago, before I started this kind of more in-depth research, I came to the conclusion that, you know, women look like a reserve army to a certain extent, because if you want to use a football metaphor, we can say they were on the bench, they were waiting to be called. And it's clear that on the one hand, we can see that we start paying attention to the women when either the men are in prison or they're dead. But then I came back to that question to say that actually we were perhaps being limited in the sense that we were saying that they were a reserve army, but it was only once that the men were away that we started to pay more attention to them. So my research has moved on from that to say actually women have always been there. Women have been more partners, not necessarily partners in crime, but partners in life. And the way that we look at these groups is we only look at them what they do in the street. We don't look and consider what they do in the home. And I wanted in a way to sort of challenge that, to say we need to look at these more nuanced spaces, because women are very much, how can I say, the bosses of the household. And that gives them power and that gives them capital, which they then can take and they can have it in the street with the other members, but they can also have it with their partners. So the reserve army was helpful, but I just found that it was kind of explaining what law enforcement saw when they started looking. And I tried to sort of go beyond that and start looking before law enforcement looked, and to see that actually we have more partnerships rather than just men who kind of do all that they want to do.
Mm-hmm. And obviously in your studies, there is this qualitative analysis. You have your interviews, you have analysis of trial and police documents that you had access to. What challenges did you encounter while collecting and interpreting this data? And then my second question is, whether it's from the documents or as a conclusion of analyzing a lot of documentation, how would you also see the interaction between law enforcement or even the investigations, even the questions while approaching a male suspect, so to speak, a male mafioso, versus a woman involved in the mafia? So two questions.
Two very small questions, two very simple questions. First of all, obviously, researching organized crime is particularly difficult because it is a kind of invisible space. It's a kind of hidden and a shadow kind of world where, it's difficult to identify. It's difficult to talk to people because of the silence, l'omertà, that follows and that is kind of very much part of a self-protection strategy of these groups. So researching mafias is I think very, very challenging. And before that, we have the challenge that all academics looking at this face is, what is organized crime? What is mafia? So this is particularly kind of challenging. I've kind of wanted to have a more ethnographic approach. Obviously, I'm a white middle class European, so I want to also acknowledge my position and my lens when I go into the field and I try and understand what is going on. It takes a lot of time. And there are obviously also ethical questions. How do you engage? How do you participate? And how do you talk to people who are obviously not necessarily going to want to tell you what they do? So it's very challenging. For me, the ethics is about respect and is about transparency, of trying to not kind of fool anybody, trying to understand. And that's why, to a certain extent, a lot of my work has been around interviewing people who are under protection rather than necessarily go and sort of, do a full ethnographic piece, which has become part of the community of that group that you want to study. So I use more ethnographic interviews, but all of this is very, very challenging, I think. And also, I think we've also got to remember that when you talk to people, people tell them what they want to tell you. And as you said, how do you unpack that? How do you interpret that? And that is very, very challenging. And I think for me, it's not so much the challenge, but it's about the acknowledgement of that. I think if I acknowledge, first of all, my position and the lens that I come and I use, that's the first step in itself. And then to acknowledge the lens and the position and the lived experiences that the people I talk to, that's another step, I think, which is helpful to then be able to pack together or to unpack and analyze what they say and how I receive what they say. I found it fascinating with the women of the Camorra, how a lot of them were unable to acknowledge their own roles. In other words, unable to acknowledge their agency of, they accepted the portrayal or the projection of being passive. This is what, this is the label they'd been given by the crime group and also law enforcement and also by society, and that they kind of accepted that. And when I tried to challenge and saying, but hang on a second, you know, you're not just passive, you are involved, you have a voice, you're telling people what to do, you're participating in the strategies that are being developed. It took time for them to sort of say, you're right. And I don't think I got to a point where the majority of them actually said, yes, you're right. So I just think that if that already can be analysed and kind of written down, that's already a contribution in itself, rather than just use, you know, quantitative statistics. Here it's about trying to unpack the difficulty where, you know, women who are active probably, or and to a certain extent, don't see themselves as active. They don't see themselves as participating within this greater form of criminal behavior. So field work is very, very challenging. And for me, it's important because it's always kind of a journey, not only of discovering something new around a specific research project, but it's also a journey of self-reflection and of self-discovery for me, because I am not of this world and I want to sort of try and understand this world, and I want to try and contribute to our understanding this world. So it is, I think the field work is very challenging on organized crime in general, on Italian mafias as well, and also in relation to the question of gender, because it's kind of, you know, we're given a story of what it is and we accept it rather than challenge and say, hang on a second, you know, where are the women? Nobody seems to ask where the women are. And if you have a look at the traditional studies on mafias, there's no mention of the women. The women are an appendix. They're a footnote. They're a kind of added extra. And I think that's one of the things that I want to challenge, is saying we should be including women as part of the general analysis and not just as an afterthought. And your second question about law enforcement, it took me a bit of time to sort of stop and think of how, you know, you mentioned quite rightly that I use judicial documents, and it took me a lot of not too much time, but I quickly kind of a thought about how, if I'm analyzing a law enforcement document, what is it that I'm analyzing? And I kind of quickly concluded that actually I wasn't analyzing what was there. I was analyzing the interpretation of somebody who was writing it. And therefore, we tended to have the law enforcement's perspective that tended to be male. It tended to be a male reconstruction of a picture. And even if, you know, people say, well, let's have more women police officers, and that doesn't necessarily change things, because these women also have a male-centric perspective. So the law enforcement documentation we have is not necessarily kind of thinking, what about the women? And is not necessarily thinking maybe they have a role. And there are so many examples where, you know, the law enforcement were in a way projecting this male image, and it kind of came back to them, rather than kind of saying, hang on a second, you know, the woman actually is involved and is participating.
I'm going to share a couple of pictures. Let me just bring them up, because I think the segue is also the resurgence, the portrayal of this mob wife aesthetic that has seen a revival on social media platforms, and often drawing inspiration from fictional characters like Adriana Lacerva, Connie Corleone, Carmela Soprano. And how do you perceive the influence of such media portrayals on public understanding of women's roles in organized crime? There are some pictures, and probably I got them from one of your articles, so of also comparing the aesthetic between very fleshy mob wives, where we see a lot of leopard, really a little bit in your face, okay, and some other models of again, other women in mafia, where they're very subtle. You wouldn't be able to distinguish them from the crowd, and so forth. So let's talk about the media influence, and then if we can compare the two pictures that I've seen and the message that they portray, or on their roles, lifestyles, and all of that.
I mean, first of all, I think a general point that has to be made, which I find is fascinating, is sometimes we need to sort of take a step back and think, who influences who? Is it the reality of the mafia, its violence, its corruption, that is influencing writers and how writers portray them? or is it how the writers see them in their head and how the writers imagine them that also then have an influence on the actual dress code and the behavior of these kind of criminals? I remember when I was doing my PhD, I spoke to somebody he wasn't violent. Violence wasn't his thing. He was more a kind of political mediator. And I sort of said to him, what do you think about the way that mafia bosses are portrayed in The Godfather, for example? And, he said, that's where we take our inspiration from. We take our inspiration from films on how we should dress. This is where, so it's kind of a really interesting relationship, who influences who. And actually, we then end up with, someone's imagination actually having a massive impact and an influence and shaping how people think they should be behaving, what they should be dressing, what they should be doing, but also how they should be dressing. And I think that's a real interesting relationship that we should be looking at closer, because it's very, very kind of indicative of how subtle the influence is, and how organized crime, it is I'm not saying a myth, but it can also be something that we create an imaginative portrayal. So I think that's something that we need to sort of take into account. I think, the media's influence on shaping and looking at these phenomena is a really delicate one to a certain extent. In Italy, there's been a whole discussion around the influence of Roberto Saviano's kind of creation, if you want, and the description of baby gangs and how that they behave, and whether they're influencing baby gangs in places like Naples, and whether they understand, his portrayal comes obviously from law enforcement documents, but that they take that and that they kind of normalize violence, and that they normalize what is being said, and we have an overlap and confusion between kind of the imaginary and reality, and that's where it can become dangerous, when the young people don't necessarily have the cultural filters to actually analyze what is being presented, and they take that as the kind of the inspiration and the norm, and that violence is all about what they should be doing and how they should be behaving and what they should be carrying, a knife or a gun. So I think the media's role is really important, on the one hand, to denounce these phenomena, but at the same time, it feeds into a narrative that perhaps is quite far from reality. And I always find that there is a big gap between reality and then how it's picked up in by journalists. And journalists are not doing the same kind of job that I'm doing. They're getting a story out. They need to make it kind of sexy to sell papers. They need to kind of, add perhaps a bit more context or a bit more kind of description and adjectives to make it kind of more relevant for the person who wants a quick read. So we have this kind of, portrayal that sometimes is kind of exaggerated or put into sort of stereotypical kind of terms, which then becomes the norm, which then becomes accepted as the truth to a certain extent, when actually it's an interpretation of the truth by a journalist who obviously wants to sell. Whereas as academics, we're not interested in selling, we're interested in unpacking and understanding what it looks like. And I've always found that it's a very dangerous sort of slippery slope, because there's a gap, there's a disjuncture between the journalist account that are trying to make it kind of relevant and sexy to sell, and then how society receives that, and how policymakers receive that. Policymakers will be taken by this or this creation or this imagery that has been sort of sold by journalists, and then they'll try and make policy around that. And therefore we're actually kind of in lots of kind of vacuums where the reality is very different from what is being kind of written and sold, and then policymakers will make policy in relation to this image, which is, I'm not saying fictive, but an image which is full of different kind of aspects. Exactly. And the pictures, the photographs that you showed are really interesting, because I think that there is a distinction to be made between perhaps American style, Italo-American kind of mafias, where women are obviously less kind of traditional compared to our Italian mafia women. And the other thing you've got to remember is that Italian mafia women, they might like luxury goods, but they don't want to necessarily stick out. They don't want to draw attention. This isn't about sort of showing off. This is about staying well under the radar because you don't want to be drawing attention to yourself. Whereas the American mafias we've seen, different context, different kind of a phenomena where women perhaps can be seen more, or within the context of American society, that's the norm. Whereas in Italian society, it's about staying under the radar, because if you stay under the radar, then you can get on with business. You don't really want to draw attention to yourselves. There was a study done a couple of years ago where this study concluded that when we had a look at the number of people and who the people were who were front names for Italian mafias, the high percentage was women. Now, for me, that's not at all surprising, because women are in a way being used where people don't necessarily expect them. So front names are really kind of women are frequently used as front names because nobody's going to think that they could be involved or that they could be front names. So what's going on is this kind of recurring process of projection of kind of sexist ideas around how women are passive, women are weak, women are incapable. And that means that these groups kind of are branding that while getting on with it and using women for their own ends.
Okay, so we're going to take a little break, hear from our sponsors, and then we will be back. Applying for Italian citizenship? Need documents translation? Istituto Mondo Italiano provides certified translations and assistance services. Be sure to visit us at istitutomondoitaliano.org and schedule your free consultation. Un caffè, per favore. My first cup of coffee sets the tone for my entire day, and I get my coffee at La Prima Espresso. La Prima has been brewing Pittsburgh Express coffee for over 35 years. Try any of their in-house roasted varieties of beans from all over the world at home, or come and enjoy an espresso or a cappuccino at any of their locations, with their friendly baristas and familiar faces who will make you feel at home. Visit laprima.com to get La Prima Espresso coffee at your door. Okay, so I think everyone is listening to this very interesting conversation with Professor Felia Allum, where we are discussing the role of women in the mafia. So yes, something that you just did an analysis, a comparison, a little bit about the Italian mafia wives, a little different from the American mafia wives. Maybe also because there might be differences in the structure of the different groups. We did have a while back as a guest Maria Rosa Cutrufelli, who wrote a beautiful book, Tina Mafia Soldier, where she actually had the ability to follow and interview a character that was indeed a real story. And one of the things that she also noticed, and I don't know if this is also evident in your studies as you have seen the documentation and so forth, also how their approach to being public has changed versus I remember growing up, if there were in Italy, when there were news of mafia boss being caught, they always had their jacket on, trying to cover their identity, not wanting to be seen in that moment. Whereas now it's all about posing for the pictures. They almost wants to have a followers. They wants to have almost like a fans club. Have you noticed any of that in your studies or just I was wondering if you have seen some of their behaviors, being a little more public versus hidden.
I think, I think social media is perhaps changing how certain groups or certain individuals behave, but I think that ultimately we're still in a phase where, Italian mafias can't really be very public because it means you can't necessarily make money. So if the ultimate aim is power and profit and infiltrating the legitimate economy, then you don't want to be too visible. You don't want to draw too much attention to yourself. But it's clear that social media is adding another layer of kind of complexity to the landscape within which these kind of crime groups find themselves, especially younger generations where, technology is developing very, very quickly, and young people are using technology in different kind of ways. For the moment, it seems to be that it's just a way of appearing, a way of existing, drawing attention to yourself. And perhaps, from my perspective, there's kind of a lot of more visibility, but they're probably not very important players to a certain extent. And what we see taking place on social platforms is kind of conversations from distance, long distance conversations between different kind of rival groups or different kind of enemies, who will then end up in the street ultimately to sort of finish up what they started. But it's kind of, the virtual world is just another layer of this kind of, as you say, placing and existing, and therefore you need to also control the virtual world. And how do you control the virtual world? Is by having more likes, is by having more people say how brilliant you are. But I don't think that serious organized crime criminals can afford to be on those platforms. Otherwise, law enforcement are developing and are trying to find techniques where they can trace them, where they can, infiltrate their networks, etc. So we've got this kind of, on the one hand, wanting to be seen, because that's also about power on the virtual platforms. Being seen, you're going to get more followers, you're going to get more people who kind of respect you. But the real serious players don't really want to be
Yeah.
seen, because if they're being seen, then obviously their operations are going to be uncovered. So there's a delicate balance between how you do that. And I think too much kind of presence on social media is not helpful. But at the same time, there's that appetite by younger generations, because that's how they're being brought up, to have more likes, to have more photographs. We know that we can see that there are a lot of kind of, not only Facebook, but Instagram, but now obviously TikTok, where there's a lot of kind of different kind of conversations going on, but also different kinds of power dynamics to a certain extent, because it's about appearance. It's in that world, it's about appearance, whereas in the real street, it's about social consensus and how you provide social consensus to the local community, whether that means that you provide food or you get a job for somebody. Whereas in the virtual world, it's about kind of, how you project yourself as being a good person, or looking good, or having the latest Rolex. So that space now needs to be filled, but you've got to be very careful on how you fill it. You don't want to give too much away. And we've got loads of examples of people who are on the run, who've put a photograph on Facebook and then they've been arrested because it's easily identifiable, or somebody sent a message, again, I don't know, on Instagram or on TikTok, and again being recognized. And therefore, so it's a delicate balance between wanting to appear, wanting to sort of be the person in control, and not give too much away, because law enforcement are also looking. And law enforcement in Italy, perhaps not, but in France, Belgium, Germany, we can see that they really are developing very, very quickly techniques to be able to see what is going on, and on the front, being in the front seat, seeing what's going on. And therefore, you've got to be careful. I think you can't overplay it. Otherwise, you'll kind of end
Putting
up
yourself
in.
out there. Yes.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Being too loud, being too visible is not part of the kind of, softly invisible money-making strategy. So you've got to be careful. But it's obviously a new space that we can see different individuals trying to navigate, and some are more successful than others.
Mhm. So by starting to follow your work and your research, that led me also to watch The Good Mothers, I think produced, available on Disney. And I was wondering if maybe you can elaborate a little bit about what The Good Mothers is all about, and how that fits into your research, whether you found that it did explore thoroughly the roles of women in mafia, or if you found it lacking in that context.
So I think the Good Mothers is a good contribution to the debate around seeing women. It's a kind of, I can't remember, is it 3 or 4 episodes looking at various life stories of women who have been in the Calabrian Mafia and who have had some really awful experiences. So there are stories of 3 different women who have been involved, born and been involved in the Calabrian Ndrangheta. And each of these women rebels against the system and tries to break free. And they try to break free from their families, from their fathers, from their husbands. Some of them manage it more successfully than others. In particular, I think I can't remember exactly. One of them survives. I think two of the, out of the three stories survives, and the accounts are really powerful because there is a woman prosecutor who listens to them, who takes their case on, who tries to help them break free from this very kind of brutish system, which is kind of making them into victims. And in this case, they are very much in as victims. And so these stories are powerful because they focus on them. They don't focus, as I said, on the male characters, but on them and how they want to break free and how they're rebelling against this system. And in a way, my work is slightly different because I'm not interested in the rebels. I'm interested in the women who are there and who are fully compliant and fully involved. And therefore, for me, Good Mothers helped us by seeing the women for the first time, why centering, I talked before about male centric, whereas here it's much more female centric. But I think that it again reinforced the idea of not passivity as much as victimhood. It's about these women being victims to the patriarchal system of the Calabrian Ndrangheta, the Calabrian Mafia. And for me, that's where I got slightly stuck and sort of saying, the patriarchal system exists, but it is also made up of women as well as men. And therefore, I found it kind of helpful as a kind of let's focus on the women, but it ended up showing the women as victims. And there was no kind of attention paid to, for example, in the case of I think it's I can't remember her name, Cacciola, the case of the woman who is declared dead by suicide because she has drunk some horrific poison. The role of the mother, who is heavily involved in that, holding her head and helping the father force the liquid down her daughter's lungs, that's not drawn out. That's kind of in a way not made relevant. And therefore, what I want to do is to make relevant all participants to show, yes, we do have women victims. Having said that, there are also men who've been victims. There are examples of men who've fallen in love with the daughter of the boss, and they've both been killed, but we don't kind of recount the men's kind of victimhoods, and we don't necessarily then shine a light on the participants and the active involvement of the women within that patriarchy. And that's why in my book I talk about women who bargain with patriarchy. In other words, patriarchy is not putting all women into situations of subordination. There are women who also are able to deal with it and make it work for them. So I think that, as I said at the start, Good Mothers is a good first step, but it ultimately leaves us with that kind of so women are still victims. And whereas what I'm trying to do is saying, yeah, these women are victims, but there are also women who are complicit to the patriarchy, who know how to navigate and to work with the patriarchy. And we have some strong women within all these crime groups. And that's why I think that, it's too simplistic to say, oh, Southern Italy, they're all it's a whole patriarchal system. There are also very strong matriarchs, but we just don't see them because we concentrate on the street rather than the household.
Wonderful. So obviously this is a very interesting topic and not an easy one to bring to the classroom, but you have done a wonderful job with your students presented, and I believe they also had done projects and videos where they had to write out their characters. I only have little bits of information, so I would like you to share what you have been able to bring to the classroom and how you structured the program.
So I've been very fortunate to be able to teach organised crime at the University of Bath for the last 20 years, and in various kind of formulas. And a couple of years ago, and next year, hopefully I'll be starting back again into this particular course in this particular format. I just got very frustrated with the traditional kind of lecture seminar format, especially when it comes to organised crime. So I was very lucky. I had an assistant who helped me think through and make this kind of as student-centered as possible, and making them think on their feet and making them kind of really develop all these other skills that perhaps by just having your traditional lecture seminar structure you're not able to do. So I was able to have the flexibility to have, on the one hand, your traditional lectures. My students would get 3 or 4 lectures to get the basic academic content, and then we had this other kind of parallel course where we had about 5 or 6 sessions, and I had 2 groups at the time, so I had about 40 students, and within each group we had 20 students, and randomly they would be allocated roles. So there was the boss, there was the wife, and the boss and the wife would then recruit. They had to recruit these individual members. The members, my students, had made their own characters, and therefore they, in a way, had to go to a job interview. So one of the games was a job interview where they were interviewed, and the boss and his wife had to decide whether they wanted them. Then they had to develop an economic plan, and they had to present the business plan to see whether it actually made sense, so that they could understand, if you want, the transition from the illegitimate, illegal, to the business world, to the legitimate. So this was all kind of games where the students were thinking on the feet, but ultimately it was about them writing a role play. So there were four scenarios where the students had a challenge. So one of them was, for example, the first one was the fact that one of the members, the son of the mafia boss, was a homosexual, and therefore that would actually get the students to challenge, you know, the kind of more strict Catholic traditional way that the crime groups still to a certain extent function, and therefore they had to manage and they had to decide how that problem would be resolved. And therefore each scenario, so that was one scenario. Another scenario was an election, so the politician had to sort of have it get and collect votes from all the different groups. Then we had another one on drug trafficking, where the drugs were stolen. So each role play was actually how can I say, a dilemma, was a problem that they then had to act out. And what was interesting is they had to write up what they thought would happen, and then we would act it out, and they would act it out, and it would last about 2 minutes. It was quite intense, but there was all these different kind of case scenarios that would take place on how do you resolve it. And one year it was very interesting because one of the groups ends up by killing everybody. On the one hand, the only answer was to kill everybody, and then in the other group it was all about making friends and making sure that everybody respected each other. So it was a kind of trying to make them think outside the box. One of the criticisms I had straight away by one student, which I'll never forget, was, oh, well, you're trying to teach us to be criminals. And the others turned around quite nicely saying, no, 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 that's not what's happening here. What's happening is that we kind of digest the academic literature and we think in the ways that, you know, we can see and we can reflect. Because also what's fundamental about that whole exercise is we have a massive debrief. What happened? Why did it happen? Why did you make that decision? And what was also good was that, you know, I did this when social media was developing. So some of them used Instagram, set up Instagram accounts. Others did films. So for the electoral campaign, they do a little video, which was really quite interesting. So this is kind of, you know, a whole array of different kind of skills that they're kind of taking on and developing, and also to kind of critically think, you know, why would somebody do that? Why would somebody who's got a good salary want to be involved in organized crime? Why does that happen? So it's kind of a very kind of, as I said, full on way of teaching. It's very satisfying, I must admit. And I haven't been able to do it for the last 2 years because I've been away, but hopefully I will be able to recruit enough students in September to start again. And I'll always remember my students saying, you know, we never get up for a 9 o'clock on Friday morning, but we got up for this because, you know, it was so worth it. It's very rewarding.
And you have been presenting internationally. You also speak French beautifully. I heard one of your presentations in French, so I was wondering also what is the perception of your work also overseas, because it might be an unexpected topic, but again, there is so much analysis in it, and again, a different. So I was wondering how you know. How the work is perceived, and where do you think moving forward there are areas that will require further research, whether it's from you or the criminal, the law enforcement?
So this is a really interesting question. I mean, I'm still kind of the book was only published about a year ago now, and a version is going to come out soon in Italian. And for me, as I said at the beginning, it's about challenging. It's very much about challenging people's way of thinking in order to be able to help them think differently. So I'm still waiting to see very much how the kind of community responds to. I've had a good book review come out, but I am still, I think, waiting for sort of criticism to sort of say, you know, this is too easy, to sort of challenge the previous analysis, because a lot, as I said, a lot of the previous analysis by some of my Italian colleagues, which has been brilliant around looking and talking about how women are very much have this double identity. In other words, they're present but ignored, whereas what I found lacking in that was the notion of agency. And that's why I think my contribution is around trying to make people see women as agents. We might not like that they're making decisions that are bad or good, but it's recognizing that they do have some way. Some of them obviously cannot or have limited agency, but I want to sort of show that women have kind of agency. So I'm trying to push that kind of agenda in the work that I'm doing, and trying to sort of, you know, stimulate also law enforcement to think about the women and to look at the women when they have an operation or a case in front of them, rather than just dismiss them as irrelevant. So that's a way of proceeding or moving forward. I've been lucky to work with the Organization for Economic Security and Cooperation and in Europe, and we did a report on the role of women, and we tried to sort of challenge that, to sort of show that we can't carry on looking at women as passive actors, because if we do that, then we're not getting a full picture of organized crime. And that's in a way ultimately where I end up, to sort of say, so far studies on organized crime have only given us a partial picture. They haven't really kind of moved beyond this kind of sexist approach. And when people sort of say, oh, women aren't involved, I sort of think, well, that's a very sort of narrow way of looking at it. We've got to widen our understanding of how we are as a society not able to recognize women, or when we do recognize them, we put them in these kind of reductive categories. You know, they're either mothers, they're either ill, they're either, you know, we have these very set kind of ways of looking at women. Ultimately, and sadly, I think it's because we're not interested in women. And I'm not a gender person, I'm not a gender specialist, but I think, and I conclude, that we're just not interested in the well-being, or we're not interested in how we look after women within the kind of criminal underworld. And when it comes to, you know, where do we go with this? I mean, I'm trying to work, and I'm trying to finish a book which is more comparative in tone, to sort of show that ultimately it's not necessarily about the market or the organization, it's more about society, and society's kind of power dynamics, and how we see and how women are. And therefore patriarchy is a helpful starting point, but I'm not sure it tells the whole story. So we need to have more studies on women, but women as part of the bigger picture, rather than, as I said earlier, just a footnote or an appendix to the general kind of studies that we have on organized crime. So that's where I'm heading, is to sort of do more comparative. I hope to finish writing my book on comparative stuff, and ultimately that will lead to trying to stimulate law enforcement to take on a perspective where they include women, where they see the women and they don't kind of ignore them or erase them, which it seems to me to be the case. We erase women too easily. I don't know who that benefits, but it doesn't benefit the women. So, you know, we're kind of in a perpetual cycle, rather than sort of looking at them, seeing them, and helping them out of that situation.
So the book that you were referring to, I'm assuming it's Women of the Mafia, and is currently available, and you say it's getting translated into Italian. Is that correct? Wonderful.
Yeah.
So for people that would like to pursue this topic further, and I was wondering, you know, obviously starting with your work and your book, are they, again, some other unfortunately, I would have to refer to movies or some other stories that you would recommend. I said, why don't you take a closer look at this to see the portrayal of women in mafia? Is there something that you would recommend?
Well, there are lots of, I mean, I think that there are lots of really interesting films that have come out of Italy over the last couple of years. Una Femmina by Francesco Costabile, A Chiara, that came out a couple of years ago. These are all wonderful films that put women at the center of the story. There's also, there's another one that now I've forgotten the title, but we're very lucky that in the last sort of 5 or 6 years there've been 2 or 3 books, 2 or 3 films by young Italian film directors. As I say, Una Femmina. The other one is A Chiara, which is also really interesting. And as I said, the third one, I should have written it down. We showed it last year in Bath. I've just forgotten it. It's much more violent. I think the people in Bath found it quite violent to look at. So there's a lot of, I think, interesting. One of the problems though, Viviana, is that we don't talk enough about mafias. It seems to me that in Italy at the moment we're not really it's been pushed under the carpet, which is a shame, because it's only by talking about Italian mafias that we can actually move forward. So from my perspective, that's also part of what I want to do, is to talk about Italian mafias. And in terms of books, there are some really good classics. They're kind of looking at, as I said, women within a more subordinate position, by the work by Alessandra Dino, Renata Siebert, Ombretta Ingrasci. They're all doing wonderful work of trying to look at women, also lived experiences. They deal more with the Sicilian Mafia and with the Calabrian Mafia. My work is more based for the moment on the Neapolitan Mafia, but in my comparative piece, I will also be looking at the women in Cosa Nostra from a more historical perspective. So I've gone back to have a look at the Maxi trial to see where the women were, what they were saying, and to show that, again, if we look and analyze the Maxi trial judicial documents, the women are very much there. They are associates, they're partners, they are very much there. But Italian society and also Italian law dismiss them as irrelevant because they were relatives. And therefore, that's also one of the important parts of the story, is that Italian society dismisses women because they're relatives. And therefore, that in a way seems to negate their criminal existence or their participation. So I think there's a lot out there. I think that, there's a lot of interesting, if one wants to go looking. The problem is that mainstream organized crime studies and mainstream Italian mafia studies is probably produced majority in the majority by men, and therefore this is seen as not particularly relevant, or because Cosa Nostra presents as a male-only organization, we accept that. And we don't challenge that actually we must be looking beyond just the structure of an organization to see that there are women all around, and that, just because they want to say we are Cosa Nostra, we are an organization with only men, that doesn't mean we need to accept that. We can then say, hang on a second, there's all the wives, there's all the sisters, there's this whole level of complicity, but it's kind of eradicated and erased because it's women. And that, I think, is the issue that I think we need to really resolve. So, as I said before, for me, I see this very much as a photograph, a family photograph, where we only see the male characters. And therefore, our understanding and our picture has been very partial. And if we carry on like that, we're just not going anywhere, because we just ignore the women. We don't understand their predicament. We can't help them out because we're just not acknowledging their existence. And yet, if there were no women, all these organizations would be in serious trouble. All these organizations would just not be able to cope, would not be able to work. So it's kind of this contradiction that we don't want to look at the women, but without the women, the structure doesn't work. And then, to add to that, if we go and have a look at the criminal justice system seems to punish the women. So on the one hand, we're saying women are important because they're mothers. And then when they get into the criminal justice system, we say, hang on a second, she's a drug dealer and a mother, so she'll be punished twice, compared to her husband, who's only seen as a drug dealer and not a father. So there's all these levels of kind of complex intersectionality, which means that, we end up not looking at the women. And therefore, I just think we need to sort of have a step forward just to be able to acknowledge what they are, who they are, what they're doing, and how they're an important part of this picture. And so far, that doesn't seem to have happened, according to me.
Well, we'll follow up maybe a year from now. We'll see what might have come to light, or if anything has changed. But unfortunately, our time together is up, and il Big Ben ha detto stop. And it's time for us to say arrivederci alla prossima. And we want to thank you for tuning in into the program. And if you have any questions or comments, or if you have any topics you would like us to address, please contact us at italianradiohour@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. And remember, if you or any of your family and friends have missed a prior episode or would like to listen to this episode again, subscribe to the Italian Radio Hour on YouTube or where you catch your favorite podcasts. And don't forget to share, because sharing is caring. I would like to thank my guest again, Professor Felia Allum, our sponsors, Istituto Mondo Italiano and La Prima Espresso. Until next time, alla prossima. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you for having me.